The day started like any other in downtown Chicago. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, casting a gray shadow over the bustling city streets. Cars honked impatiently as traffic crawled along the narrow roads, and pedestrians hurried past, storefronts clutching their coats tightly against the chilly wind. Among them was Laura Bennett, the newly appointed FBI director, who had decided to make an unannounced visit to the local police precinct. Her goal was simple: to build better relationships between federal agencies and local law enforcement. But what began as a routine trip would soon spiral into something far more dramatic. Laura stepped out of her car dressed casually in jeans and a dark jacket. She didn't want to draw attention to herself or create unnecessary formality during her surprise visit. With a small leather bag slung over her shoulder, she walked toward the federal building where the meeting was scheduled to take place. As she approached the entrance, she noticed a group of officers standing nearby, chatting loudly about last night's football game. One of them caught her eye, a tall man with broad shoulders and a stern expression. His name tag read Officer Greg Miller. Greg wasn't having a good morning. He'd been called in early to deal with a string of petty crimes that had kept him busy all night. To make matters worse, his coffee had spilled on his uniform just before leaving home, leaving a dark stain near his chest. When he saw Laura approaching, his instincts kicked in. Something about her seemed off. Her casual clothes, the lack of any visible badge, and the way she glanced around nervously made him suspicious. "Hey, you," Greg called out, raising his voice above the hum of the crowd. "Stop right there." Laura turned, surprised by the sharp tone. "Me?" she asked, pointing to herself. "Is there a problem?" "You tell me," Greg replied, narrowing his eyes. "What are you doing here? This is a restricted area." Laura smiled politely, trying not to escalate the situation. "I'm here for a meeting at the federal building. I'm with the FBI." She reached into her bag to pull out her identification but froze when she saw Greg's hand move toward his holster. His jaw tightened as he took a step closer, his posture rigid and aggressive. "I don't know who you are, lady," Greg said, his voice dripping with suspicion, "but you're not getting anywhere near this building without proving it first." By now a small crowd had gathered, curious about the commotion. Laura felt a flicker of irritation but kept her tone calm. "Look, Officer Miller, I understand your concern. Let me show you my ID." She pulled out her credentials and held them up, making sure they were clearly visible, but Greg didn't seem satisfied. Instead of looking at the badge, he focused on her appearance, the way she carried herself, the absence of a formal suit, and the fact that she hadn't announced her arrival beforehand. In his mind, these details only confirmed his suspicions. "That could be fake," he snapped. "You think I'm gonna fall for some cheap trick?" Laura sighed, realizing that reasoning with him might not work. "If you'd let me explain—" "No explanations," Greg interrupted, his face reddening. With anger. "You're coming with me until we figure out who you really are." He grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her toward him. The crowd gasped and someone shouted, "Leave her alone!" The tension escalated quickly. Greg's grip tightened and Laura winced in pain. "Let go of me," she demanded, her voice firm despite the fear creeping into her chest. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "I don't care who you are," Greg shot back, his words laced with hostility. "You're not above the law." Before things could get worse, another officer stepped forward. It was Chris Dawson, a young agent assigned to assist Laura during her visit. He had been observing from a distance, unsure whether to intervene, but now he knew he couldn't stand by and watch. "Officer Miller, stand down," Chris said firmly, positioning himself between Greg and Laura. Greg hesitated, his grip loosening, slightly. "Stay out of this, Dawson. This doesn't concern you." "It does if you're harassing a federal official," Chris countered, his tone unwavering. "Director Bennett, are you okay?" Laura nodded, rubbing her arm where Greg had grabbed her. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed a hint of unease. Turning back to Greg, she added, "Officer Miller, I suggest you rethink your approach before this gets even more out of hand." But Greg wasn't ready to back down. If anything, Chris's interference only fueled his frustration. "You people always stick together," he muttered under his breath, glaring at both Laura and Chris. Then, in a moment that shocked everyone present, he drew his gun and pointed it directly at Laura. The crowd erupted into chaos. People screamed and scrambled to get away, while others whipped out their phones to record the scene. Laura stood frozen, staring down the barrel of the weapon, her heart pounding in her chest. For a split second, time seemed to stop. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Miller?" Chris barked, his hands raised in surrender. "Put the gun down." Greg ignored him, his focus entirely on Laura. "You think you can come here and boss us around? You think you're better than us?" His voice trembled with rage, each word punctuated by the shaking of his weapon. "Well, guess what? Not today." Laura refused to show fear. Despite the danger she was in, she locked eyes with Greg, her gaze steady and resolute. "This isn't how real officers behave," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "And deep down you know it too." Her words struck a nerve. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across Greg's face. But before he could react, Chris seized the opportunity to act. Moving swiftly, he lunged forward and knocked the gun out of Greg's hand, sending it skittering across the pavement. Other officers rushed in to restrain Greg, pinning him to the ground as he struggled and swore. As the dust settled, Laura exhaled deeply, her legs trembling beneath her. She looked around at the stunned faces of the crowd, many of whom were still filming the aftermath. Someone handed her a tissue, which she used to dab at the tears forming in the corners of her eyes. Not from sadness, but from sheer disbelief at what had just transpired. Within minutes, news vans arrived on the scene, their cameras rolling as reporters clamored for details. Word of the incident spread rapidly, igniting debates online and sparking outrage across social media platforms. Videos of Greg pointing his gun at Laura went viral, accompanied by hashtags calling for justice and accountability. Back at the precinct, Captain Rachel Monroe watched the footage unfold on her office TV, her expression grim. She knew Greg well, or thought she did, and never imagined he'd act so recklessly. Still, the evidence was undeniable. Whatever excuses he might offer later, one thing was certain: his career as a police officer was over. For Laura, the ordeal was far from finished. As she sat in a quiet corner of the federal building, sipping a cup of tea provided by a sympathetic colleague, she reflected on what had happened. The experience had shaken her, yes, but it also reinforced her resolve to address the systemic issues plaguing law enforcement. If one bigot with a badge could cause such chaos, how many others were hiding in plain sight? Little did she know, this incident would mark the beginning of a long and difficult journey, one that would test her leadership, challenge her beliefs, and force her to confront uncomfortable truths about the world she sought to change. But, for now, all she could do was take a deep breath and prepare herself for whatever came next. The hours following the incident felt like a blur for everyone involved. Laura Bennett sat in a quiet conference room inside the federal building, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Her mind raced as she replayed the events over and over again. The way Greg Miller's voice had risen with anger, the feel of his grip on her arm, and the sight of his gun pointed directly at her. It all seemed surreal, like something out of a movie. Yet here she was, still processing the reality of it. Outside, the building chaos reigned. Reporters swarmed the area, shouting questions at anyone who walked by. Officers tried to maintain order, but the growing crowd made it difficult. Cell phone footage of the confrontation continued to circulate online, sparking heated debates across social media. Some people condemned Greg's actions, calling him reckless and dangerous. Others defended him, claiming he was just doing his job and accusing Laura of overstepping her authority. The divide was sharp and emotions ran high. Back at the police precinct, Captain Rachel Monroe faced an entirely different kind of storm. She had known Greg Miller for years, his gruff demeanor, his tendency to clash with federal agents, and his stubborn refusal to adapt to modern policing methods. But nothing could have prepared her for what she saw on the video clips flooding her phone and computer screens. Watching Greg point his weapon at Laura left her speechless. How could one of her officers behave so recklessly? And why hadn't she seen this coming? Rachel wasted no time launching an internal investigation. She called an emergency meeting with her senior staff, demanding answers about Greg's conduct. "This isn't just about today," she told them sternly. "We need to look at everything, every complaint, every warning, every red flag we might have missed." Her voice carried both frustration and guilt, knowing full well that Greg's behavior hadn't appeared out of nowhere. As the team dug deeper, they uncovered a troubling pattern. Over the years, several civilians and even some fellow officers had filed complaints against Greg, alleging verbal abuse, racial profiling, and excessive force. Most of these complaints had been dismissed or swept under the rug, either because of insufficient evidence or pressure from higher-ups who valued Greg's aggressive tactics. One particularly damning report came from a young officer named Alex Carter, who had witnessed Greg berating a Latino teenager during a routine traffic stop. When Alex tried to intervene, Greg had threatened to write him up for insubordination. The more Rachel learned, everything began falling into place. Greg wasn't just a rogue cop. He represented a larger problem within the department, a culture of silence and complacency that allowed bad behavior to fester unchecked. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Rachel knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. "We let this happen," she admitted to her team during another late-night meeting, "and now we're paying the price." Meanwhile, Greg was suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. Sitting alone in his small apartment, he struggled to make sense of what had happened. In his mind, he hadn't done anything wrong. Sure, maybe he'd gotten a little carried away, but wasn't that part of the job? Protecting the city meant making tough calls, and sometimes people didn't like it. That didn't mean he deserved to be vilified. Greg's bitterness only grew when he logged onto social media and saw the backlash against him. Hundreds of comments labeled him a disgrace, a bigot, and worse. He scrolled through endless posts criticizing his actions, each one fueling his anger. "They don't understand," he muttered to himself, slamming his fist on the table. "I was just doing my duty." But not everyone agreed with the online mob. Greg found support in unexpected places, particularly among fringe groups that shared his views. Online forums filled with messages praising him for standing up to federal overreach and defending law enforcement traditions. Encouraged by their words, Greg began crafting lengthy responses to critics, doubling down on his version of events. "She lied to me," he wrote in one post. "She didn't identify herself properly, and I had every right to question her." While Greg waged his digital battle, Laura returned to Washington, D.C., where the fallout from the incident followed her like a shadow. Colleagues approached her cautiously, unsure of what to say. Some offered condolences, while others asked probing questions about how she planned to handle the situation. Laura listened patiently, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than Greg Miller. This was about systemic issues that had plagued law enforcement for decades, issues she was determined to address. 2. Help navigate the political minefield ahead. Laura enlisted the assistance of Agent Chris Dawson, the man who had intervened during the confrontation. Chris was younger than most of her advisors, but his calm demeanor and quick thinking had impressed her. Together, they reviewed the details of the case, discussing potential strategies for holding Greg accountable while avoiding further escalation. Chris suggested reaching out to local leaders and community organizations to gauge public sentiment. "If we want real change," he explained, "we need to involve the people most affected by these kinds of incidents." Laura nodded in agreement, recognizing the wisdom in his approach. They scheduled a series of meetings with activists, clergy members, and residents to hear their concerns firsthand. One such meeting took place in a modest community center on Chicago's South Side. The room buzzed with energy as attendees voiced their frustrations about police misconduct and lack of accountability. A middle-aged woman named Patricia spoke passionately about her son, who had been stopped multiple times without cause. "Every time I see a squad car, my heart races," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I shouldn't have to live like that." Laura listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. Though she couldn't promise immediate solutions, she assured the group that their voices mattered. "We can't undo the past," she said, "but we can work together to build a better future." Not everyone was convinced. A young man named Jamal stood up and challenged her directly. "How do we know you're serious?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "People like you come in, make promises, and then disappear once the cameras are gone." Laura didn't shy away from the criticism. Instead, she acknowledged the mistrust and vowed to earn their confidence through action. "You're right to be skeptical," she admitted, "but I'm here because I believe things can change, if we all commit to making it happen." Back in Chicago, the investigation into Greg's conduct continued. Rachel assigned a trusted lieutenant named Marcus Lee to lead the effort, ensuring independence and transparency. Marcus worked tirelessly, interviewing witnesses, reviewing body cam footage, and poring over old records. Each new discovery painted a clearer picture of Greg's troubled history, leaving little doubt about the severity of his actions. Despite mounting evidence, Greg remained defiant. During a formal hearing at the precinct, he argued that firing him would set a dangerous precedent. "What happens next time someone questions authority?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Are we going to crucify every officer who makes a mistake?" His lawyer echoed this sentiment, framing the incident as an isolated error rather than part of a pattern. "Officer Miller acted on instinct," the attorney argued. "He may have been wrong, but he doesn't deserve to lose his career over one bad decision." But Marcus wasn't buying it. "This wasn't a bad decision," he countered. "It was a blatant disregard for protocol and human decency. We can't afford to look the other way anymore." As the days turned into weeks, public pressure intensified. News outlets covered every twist and turn of the case, keeping the story alive in the national conversation. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, holding signs that read "Justice for all" and "Hold bad cops accountable." Even politicians weighed in, using the incident to push for broader reforms. Amidst the chaos, Laura remained focused on her mission. She drafted a proposal outlining sweeping changes to improve police-community relations, including mandatory bias training, stricter oversight, and increased funding for mental health resources. Though she knew implementing these measures wouldn't be easy, she refused to back down. For Greg, the writing was on the wall. His suspension dragged on, and his legal battles drained his savings. Friends and family distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the controversy surrounding him. Alone and embittered, he began to realize the gravity of his actions, but whether he truly understood their impact remained unclear. In the end, the incident served as a catalyst for change, forcing individuals and institutions to confront uncomfortable truths. While the road ahead promised challenges, there was also hope, a fragile but persistent belief that progress was possible if enough people were willing to fight for it. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of activity for everyone involved. Laura Bennett, now back in Washington, D.C., found herself at the center of a growing storm. The public demanded answers, and politicians clamored to weigh in on the situation. Some praised her courage and leadership, while others criticized her decision to visit Chicago without proper security or advanced notice. But Laura paid little attention to the noise. Her focus was on using this moment as an opportunity to push for meaningful change. In Chicago, the investigation into Greg Miller's actions continued to uncover troubling details. Lieutenant Marcus Lee worked tirelessly, piecing together years of complaints and disciplinary records that painted a disturbing picture. It became clear that Greg wasn't just a single bad apple. He was part of a larger problem within the police department. His behavior had been tolerated, even excused, by those in power who prioritized results over ethics. This culture of indifference had allowed misconduct to flourish unchecked. As the evidence mounted, Captain Rachel Monroe faced mounting pressure from all sides. Community leaders demanded accountability, while union representatives fought tooth and nail to protect Greg's job. "We can't throw away someone's career based on one mistake," they argued, ignoring the overwhelming proof of repeated offenses. Rachel knew she was walking a tightrope, balancing the need for justice with the realities of politics. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the truth. Greg's actions reflected deeper issues that needed to be addressed. Laura, meanwhile, was determined not to let the incident fade into obscurity. She understood that moments like these often sparked outrage but rarely led to lasting reform. To prevent that from happening, she decided to take bold action. With the help of Agent Chris Dawson, she drafted a comprehensive proposal aimed at addressing systemic problems within law enforcement. The plan included mandatory bias training for officers, stricter accountability measures, and increased collaboration between federal and local agencies. But Laura knew that policies alone wouldn't be enough. Real change required trust, and trust could only be built through genuine engagement with communities most affected by police misconduct. To that end, she organized a series of town hall meetings across the country, starting with Chicago. These events provided a platform for residents to share their experiences and voice their concerns directly to federal officials. The first town hall took place in a large auditorium on the city's west side. Hundreds of people showed up, filling the room with a mix of hope and skepticism. Laura stood at the front, flanked by Chris and several other agents. As she looked out at the crowd, she felt a wave of determination wash over her. This wasn't just about Greg Miller anymore. It was about creating a system where incidents like this didn't happen in the first place. One by one, residents stepped up to the microphone. A young mother recounted how her teenage son had been stopped multiple times without cause, leaving him traumatized. An elderly man described being harassed by officers while walking home from church. Each story added another layer to the complex web of mistrust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Laura listened intently, nodding and taking notes, careful not to interrupt or dismiss anyone's pain. When it was her turn to speak, Laura chose her words carefully. "I know I can't undo what's been done," she began, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. "But I promise you this, we're going to do everything in our power to make sure it doesn't happen again." She outlined her proposals, emphasizing the importance of transparency and accountability. "Change won't come overnight," she admitted, "but if we work together, we can build a safer, fairer future for everyone." Not everyone was convinced. A man in his 30s named Jamal raised his hand during the Q&A session. "How do we know this isn't just talk?" Ende asked, his tone sharp with skepticism. "People like you come in, say all the right things, and then disappear when the cameras are gone." Laura didn't shy away from the question. Instead, she acknowledged the mistrust head-on. "You have every right to feel skeptical," she said. "Too many promises have been broken in the past. But I'm here because I believe in this cause, and because I think we owe it to each other to try." Her honesty seemed to resonate with some members of the audience. While not everyone left the meeting feeling satisfied, there was a sense that progress, however slow, was possible. Back in Chicago, Greg Miller struggled to adapt to life after his suspension. With no income and mounting legal fees, he moved in with his sister Sarah, who lived in a small suburban apartment. At first, Sarah tried to support him, encouraging him to reflect on his actions and seek counseling. But Greg's defensiveness made it difficult. "I didn't do anything wrong," he insisted repeatedly, refusing to entertain any suggestion otherwise. Sarah grew increasingly frustrated. She loved her brother, but she couldn't ignore the harm his behavior had caused. One evening, after a particularly heated argument, she handed him a stack of printed articles and social media posts detailing the backlash against him. "Read these," she said firmly. "Maybe then you'll understand why people are so angry." Reluctantly, Greg skimmed through the pages. He saw photos of protesters holding signs calling for his dismissal, read heartfelt testimonies from victims of police brutality, and scrolled through countless comments condemning his actions. For the first time, he began to see himself through someone else's eyes. It wasn't easy. His pride fought hard against the discomfort, but a glimmer of self-awareness started to emerge. Despite this, Greg remained publicly defiant. In interviews with sympathetic outlets, he doubled down on his version of events, portraying himself as a victim of political correctness and federal overreach. His supporters rallied behind him, organizing fundraisers and spreading conspiracy theories about the FBI's motives. Online forums lit up with debates, further polarizing public opinion. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Marcus Lee prepared to present his findings to Captain Rachel Monroe. The report was damning, detailing years of misconduct and institutional failures that had enabled Greg's behavior. Rachel read it carefully, her heart heavy with regret. "This is bigger than one officer," she told Marcus quietly. "It's a wake-up call for all of us." With the evidence overwhelmingly against him, Greg's fate was sealed. After weeks of deliberation, the review board unanimously voted to terminate his employment. The decision sent shockwaves through the department, dividing officers into two camps: those who supported accountability and those who felt Greg was being scapegoated. Tensions ran high, with heated arguments breaking out in locker rooms and briefing rooms alike. Greg received the news in a curt letter delivered to his sister's doorstep. Sitting alone in his bedroom, he stared at the document for a long time, unable to process what it meant. His career, the thing he'd dedicated his life to, was over. For the first time, cracks began to form in his armor of denial. Doubts crept in, whispering questions he wasn't ready to answer. Laura, too, faced resistance as she pushed forward with her reform agenda. Powerful unions and entrenched interests fought back, accusing her of overstepping her authority and undermining the integrity of law enforcement. Critics claimed her proposals would tie officers' hands, making it harder for them to do their jobs effectively. Supporters, however, argued that accountability and effectiveness weren't mutually exclusive. To counter the opposition, Laura leaned on allies like Chris Dawson and community leaders who shared her vision. Together, they built a coalition of advocates working tirelessly to rally support for the reforms. Slowly but surely, momentum began to shift. Local governments started adopting similar measures, signaling a broader cultural shift toward accountability and transparency. Amidst the chaos, a surprising development emerged. Officer Alex Carter, the young cop who had previously reported Greg for misconduct, came forward with new information. During a press conference organized by Laura's team, Alex recounted witnessing Greg's aggressive behavior on numerous occasions, including an incident where he used excessive force against a handcuffed suspect. Alex's testimony added fuel to the fire, strengthening the case for systemic reform and silencing some of Greg's defenders. For Laura, the journey was far from over. Every victory was met with fresh challenges, and every step forward seemed to invite 2 steps back. But she refused to give up. Each setback only reinforced her belief that real change required persistence and resilience. And though the road ahead promised to be long and difficult, she held on to hope, a fragile but unyielding conviction that a better future was possible. As the weeks turned into months, the incident continued to reverberate across the nation. It served as a stark reminder of the work that still needed to be done, and of the power of collective action to drive meaningful progress. For Laura, Greg, and countless others caught in the crossfire, the battle was just beginning. Months had passed since the incident, but its ripple effects continued to shape lives and policies. Greg Miller, once a proud officer of the law, now found himself adrift in a world that seemed determined to reject him. After being fired, he struggled to find steady work. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, making employers hesitant to hire him. The few odd jobs he managed to land barely covered his expenses, leaving him dependent on his sister Sarah for support. Sarah, though loving, grew increasingly exasperated with Greg's refusal to take responsibility for his actions. She urged him to seek counseling, hoping it might help him confront the biases and anger that had driven his behavior. At first, Greg resisted, dismissing therapy as unnecessary. But as weeks turned into months, the weight of his isolation began to wear him down. One rainy afternoon, after another fruitless job interview, he finally agreed to meet with a counselor named Dr. Emily Hart. Their sessions were tense at first. Greg sat stiffly in the chair, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact as Emily gently probed his thoughts and feelings. Slowly, however, cracks began to form in his defensive exterior. He admitted feeling betrayed by the system he'd served, a system he believed had turned its back on him. "I was just doing my job," he muttered. During one session, his voice tinged with bitterness. "How was I supposed to know she was the FBI director?" Emily didn't argue or challenge him directly. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions that forced Greg to reflect on his assumptions. Why had he reacted so aggressively? What made him suspicious of Laura Bennett in the first place? Over time, Greg began to see how deeply ingrained prejudices had clouded his judgment. It wasn't easy. Admitting fault never is. But he started taking small steps toward self-awareness. By the end of their 6th session, he even apologized to Sarah for snapping at her during their arguments. It was a modest victory, but it marked progress nonetheless. While Greg wrestled with his demons, Laura Bennett faced challenges of her own. Her efforts to implement reforms were met with fierce resistance from powerful unions and entrenched interests. Critics accused her of using the incident as a political tool, claiming her proposals would cripple law enforcement by tying officers' hands. Supporters, on the other hand, praised her determination, calling her a champion for accountability and transparency. Laura knew compromise would be necessary if she wanted to move forward. Working closely with Agent Chris Dawson, she revised her proposals to address some of the concerns raised by opponents. For example, instead of mandating immediate disciplinary action for minor infractions, she introduced a tiered system that allowed for corrective measures before termination. She also emphasized the importance of training programs designed to build trust between officers and communities, framing them not as punishments, but as opportunities for growth. Despite these adjustments, opposition remained strong. Lobbyists flooded Capitol Hill with petitions urging lawmakers to block the reforms, while sympathetic media outlets ran stories highlighting the risks of over-policing accountability. Laura responded by doubling down on her outreach efforts, traveling across the country to speak directly with officers and citizens alike. During one such visit to Detroit, she addressed a packed auditorium of law enforcement officials, many of whom were skeptical about her agenda. "I understand your concerns," she told them, her tone measured but firm. "No one wants to see good officers unfairly targeted, but we can't ignore the fact that bad behavior undermines public trust, and without trust, you can't do your jobs effectively." She shared examples of departments that had successfully implemented similar reforms, pointing out how they had improved morale and community relations. Though not everyone left convinced, her message resonated with some, planting seeds of change. Back in Chicago, Captain Rachel Monroe worked tirelessly to rebuild trust within her department. The fallout from Greg's firing had created deep divisions, with some officers feeling betrayed and others relieved. To bridge the gap, Rachel organized workshops focused on bias awareness and conflict resolution. She invited community leaders to participate, fostering open dialogue between law enforcement and residents. These initiatives weren't always smooth. There were heated debates and moments of tension, but they laid the groundwork for healing. One particularly poignant moment came during a joint training session held at a local high school. Officers and students sat side by side, sharing personal stories about their interactions with police. A teenage girl named Maya spoke about being stopped late at night simply because she was walking through a bad neighborhood. Her voice trembled as she described the fear she felt, knowing she hadn't done anything wrong. Across the room, Officer Alex Carter listened intently, his expression somber. When it was his turn to speak, he admitted feeling conflicted about situations like Maya's. "I joined this job to help people," he said, "but sometimes I wonder if I'm doing more harm than good." The exchange sparked a lively discussion, with participants offering suggestions for improvement. By the end of the session, there was a palpable sense of connection, a fragile but hopeful step toward mutual understanding. Amidst these developments, new evidence emerged that further complicated the narrative surrounding Greg's case. Officer Alex Carter, who had previously reported Greg for misconduct, decided to come forward publicly. In an emotional press conference organized by Laura's team, Alex recounted witnessing multiple incidents of racial profiling and excessive force committed by Greg. One story stood out: a handcuffed suspect who had been shoved to the ground and berated for no apparent reason. "I tried to report it," Alex explained, his voice steady despite the gravity of his words, "but nothing ever came of it. The testimony sent shockwaves through both the public and law enforcement communities. It reinforced the need for systemic reform while silencing some of Greg's remaining defenders. Even those who had initially supported him began distancing themselves, recognizing the depth of the problem he represented. For Greg, the renewed scrutiny was devastating. He had begun to make tentative progress in therapy, but the constant reminders of his past mistakes threatened to undo everything. Late one night, unable to sleep, he scrolled through social media and stumbled upon a video of Alex's press conference. Watching it reignited old feelings of anger and defensiveness. "He's exaggerating," Greg muttered to himself, slamming his laptop shut. Yet deep down, he couldn't deny the truth in Alex's words. The next day, Greg surprised everyone by reaching out to Dr. Emily Hart. "I need to talk," he said when she answered the phone. Their conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, delving deeper into the roots of his behavior. For the first time, Greg openly acknowledged the harm he had caused, not just to Laura Bennett, but to countless others whose lives he had touched. It was a painful admission, but also a liberating one. By confronting his flaws, Greg took the first real step toward redemption. As winter approached, signs of change began to emerge. Several cities adopted versions of Laura's reform proposals, signaling a broader cultural shift toward accountability. Community police relations showed slight improvements, thanks in part to ongoing dialogue and collaborative initiatives. While far from perfect, these developments offered a glimmer of hope, a reminder that progress, however incremental, was possible. Laura, too, found solace in the small victories. Though the journey had been grueling, she took comfort in knowing that her efforts had sparked meaningful conversations. Standing on the steps of the federal building in Chicago one crisp morning, she reflected on how far they had come. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in months she allowed herself to feel optimistic. Greg, meanwhile, continued his slow march toward self-improvement. Therapy sessions became a regular part of his routine, helping him unpack years of suppressed emotions. He even volunteered at a local shelter, finding purpose in assisting others. Though the scars of his past would never fully fade, he was learning to live with them, and perhaps one day to heal. Change, as Laura often reminded herself, was never easy. But it was worth fighting for. And as she looked out at the bustling city streets alive with possibility, she knew the fight was far from over. The months following the incident brought a mix of challenges and small victories for everyone involved. For Greg Miller, life had changed in ways he never imagined. Once a proud officer of the law, he now found himself on the outside looking in. His days were filled with introspection, therapy sessions, and volunteer work at a local shelter. Though it was hard to let go of his old identity, Greg began to see glimpses of a new path, a chance to rebuild not just his life, but also his character. One cold December morning, Greg stood in the shelter's kitchen chopping vegetables for lunch. The smell of onions and garlic filled the air as volunteers bustled around him, chatting and laughing. At first, Greg had struggled to fit in, feeling out of place among people who seemed so different from him. But over time, he realized they weren't so different after all. Many of them had made mistakes, faced hardships, or been treated unfairly by society. Listening to their stories helped Greg understand that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it and doing better moving forward. That afternoon, as Greg served food to a line of grateful visitors, a young man approached him. He looked no older than 20, with tired eyes and a hoodie pulled low over his head. "Thanks," the man said quietly, accepting a plate of soup. Then, after a pause, he added, "You used to be a cop, right?" Greg froze, unsure how to respond. Would this person judge him? Hate him? Instead, the young man simply nodded. "I heard what happened. Must have been tough losing your job like that." There was no anger in his voice, just curiosity and maybe a hint of empathy. "It was," Greg admitted, lowering his voice. "But I messed up. Big time." The young man shrugged. "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do next." Those words stayed with Greg long after the young man left. They echoed in his mind during quiet moments, reminding him that change wasn't just about fixing external problems. It was about becoming someone worthy of trust again. Therapy continued to help too. Dr. Emily Hart encouraged Greg to journal about his thoughts and feelings, which allowed him to process emotions he'd buried for years. Slowly, painfully, he began to confront the biases and fears that had shaped his behavior. Meanwhile, Laura Bennett remained steadfast in her mission to reform law enforcement. Her proposals had gained traction across the country, with several states adopting versions of her accountability measures. Mandatory bias training programs were rolled out in police departments nationwide, while oversight committees worked to ensure transparency in disciplinary actions. Though progress was slow, Laura took pride in the fact that real change was happening, even if it was incremental. Laura's efforts weren't without setbacks. Critics still accused her of undermining law enforcement, and some officers resisted the reforms, claiming they created unnecessary hurdles. But Laura didn't waver. She understood that meaningful transformation required patience and persistence. To address lingering concerns, she partnered with trusted figures within law enforcement, including Agent Chris Dawson and Officer Alex Carter, to advocate for the importance of accountability. Together, they traveled to cities and towns, holding workshops and town halls to explain the benefits of reform, not just for communities but for officers themselves. One such event took place in Chicago, where Laura returned to the same federal building where the incident had occurred. This time, the atmosphere was different. Officers and residents sat side by side, engaging in open conversations about trust, fairness, and collaboration. Laura watched as relationships formed, tentative at first, but growing stronger with each shared story. A young mother thanked an officer for helping locate her missing child, while a veteran cop expressed gratitude to a community leader for organizing neighborhood patrols. These moments may have seemed small, but they were proof that healing was possible. After the meeting, Laura stepped outside, taking a moment to breathe in the crisp winter air. Standing near the entrance, she noticed Officer Alex Carter approaching her. "Director Bennett," he said, offering a respectful nod. "Can I speak with you for a minute?" "Of course," Laura replied, gesturing for him to join her. Alex hesitated before speaking. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done. Your reforms, they're making a difference. People are starting to listen." Laura smiled warmly. "It's not just me, Alex. You've played a big part in this too." Coming forward took courage. Alex nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I just hope it leads to lasting change. We owe it to everyone who's been hurt by bad policing." "We do," Laura agreed. "And we'll keep fighting until we get there." As the year drew to a close, Captain Rachel Monroe reflected on the changes within her department. The fallout from Greg's firing had been painful, but it had also forced her team to confront uncomfortable truths. Bias training sessions became mandatory, and officers were encouraged to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Captain Monroe herself led by example, fostering an environment where honesty and accountability were valued above all else. 1. Evening, as Rachel reviewed reports from recent community meetings, she received an unexpected visitor. It was Officer Alex Carter, carrying a folder under his arm. "Captain," he said, sitting down across from her desk, "I thought you should see this." Inside the folder were testimonials from residents praising specific officers for their compassion and professionalism. One letter stood out, a single mother thanking an officer named Marcus Lee for going above and beyond to help her navigate a custody dispute. Reading it brought tears to Rachel's eyes. "This is why we do what we do," she said softly. "It's a start," Alex replied. "But there's still a long way to go," Rachel nodded. "We'll get there, step by step." For Laura, the journey was far from over. Though she had achieved significant milestones, she knew systemic issues couldn't be solved overnight. Still, she found solace in the signs of progress. During a visit to New York City, she attended a graduation ceremony for officers completing a new training program focused on de-escalation techniques. As she watched graduates shake hands with instructors, she felt a swell of pride. These men and women represented the future of policing, one built on respect, understanding, and service. Later that evening, Laura stood on a rooftop overlooking the city skyline. The lights twinkled below, a reminder of the countless lives affected by her work. She thought about Greg, whose actions had sparked this chain reaction, and about the officers and citizens striving to create a better system. Change was messy, imperfect, and often frustrating, but it was worth it. A gentle breeze brushed against her face as she gazed out at the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, blending with the hum of traffic and laughter rising from the streets. Life went on, as it always did, and though the road ahead promised challenges, Laura held on to hope, a fragile yet unyielding belief that a brighter future was possible. In the end, the incident involving Greg Miller became more than just a cautionary, it served as a catalyst for reflection, dialogue, and action. It reminded everyone, officers, leaders, and citizens, that trust wasn't given. It was earned. And while the scars of the past would always remain, they could be transformed into lessons that guided the way forward. As the clock struck midnight, ushering in a new year, Laura whispered a silent promise to herself. No matter how difficult the journey, she would continue fighting for justice, equality, and unity. Because in the end, those values weren't just ideals. They were the foundation of a world worth building.